The Old Man and the Locomotive. Background. So some time ago, 2012, one of my customers was a certain railway. This story was told to me by the old man that came from that railway to run parts and place orders. He didn't like to use the phone, always in person. He even gave me the gate code so I could wander around unsupervised on the weekends, which I did, and it was amazing. Anyways, this man was long retired, mid-80s, but he hated being retired. So he went back to work to do orders and parts. He brought a helper with him for anything heavy, and to yak for as long as you'd let him. He still worked for the railroad for fun. He loved it. It was his life. No kids, never married. I'd say the railway was his wife. Learned many fascinating things from him, but I'll share two here. The first is that they made everything for these trains. I mean it when I say everything. Foundry and lumber mill, from the castings for the locomotives and its internal and external parts and wheels, to the woodworking for the seating, dining cars, plates, forks, knives, front to back, everything. All done in-house. They live there. Housing and stores, everything. It's its own city. Because of this, no one but the yard personnel doing the work and the operators really knew much about anything that is made. This is highly relevant. The other is that they never threw any of that stuff away. Even as they develop newer and better models, it's all buried on site at those yards. It's a literal train, graveyard, and time capsule. Whole locomotives and cars were buried. All the things they used to build them, too. Huge pits. Have seen. Not relevant. Just interesting. This takes place in his youth, when he was fairly new to the railway and an apprentice, back in the 1940s. He was apprenticed to a man who had been with this railway since the 1800s. He didn't say how old he was at the time, or he did, and I don't remember, but here goes. Back then, I used to live at the railway. The railway had housing for the workers, and me and my master were pretty much joined at the hip. It's like having your super experienced supervisor, who is also your neighbor, and your houses share common facilities. So you usually get to eat together, too. My master is a few years from retirement at this point. One day, the master is approached by an internal group from the same railway, but from very far away. The company's throwing a large event, and for this event, they have restored a very old unit to show off. The problem is that after restoring the engine, while it's cooling down, it seized. They have torn it apart twice and can't find nothing wrong with it. Same thing both times. While it cools off, it seizes. They are running out of time, hence the tracking down of my master, and he was the last employee left that they could find, and they still operated one of those things actively. The locomotive they restored was previously active many years before retirement. It should work fine. They went to me to travel out of state to their yard to help diagnose the thing. I looked at it and I already knew the problem. I tell them I can simply give them directions, but they refused. I gotta get there in person. I asked for $500. Going on this trip is putting me way behind, and it's a long trip. I want compensation. And they refuse to pay me anything close to it, and I refuse to go. And they leave. A couple of weeks later, they come back. They've rebuilt it a third time, and it still seized. They are coming up on the date of the event, and they're in a panic mode, having heavily advertised the appearance of this locomotive for the event. This time, he says $600, and nice accommodations for the trip, all paid, as in the companies will foot the bills for a nicer food hotel, and all times on the road are on the clock. They, the visiting group, agreed without batting an eye this time. This is going to save them from major embarrassment. It makes them take the apprentice with them for assistance, which they didn't even argue with. We even had a driver take us, and we packed and left the same day. Took with us the regular tool bag, so nothing special. It was a 2-day ride up, and we stopped at the nicest places we could for meals. We stayed at nice hotels, and finally made it to the rail yard. Several very anxious people waited for my input. The locomotive had not been touched since they last put it together. The first thing I do is I grab my caliper and walk down both sides of the locomotive, taking measurements and making the occasional markings, and then I have them fire it up. It, of course, runs fine. I repeat my first steps, and then I have them cool it down. Sure enough, toward the end, cooling down, cling! The sound of the engine seizing. The old man telling me this always yells this part. It made me smile. Cue mass panic by the local guys. It cannot be rebuilt again in time. Master, on the other hand, walks the same route along the engine.
making a third round of measurement and markings. He then requests a sledge from the locals. He grabs the sledge and walks to the engine again, this time giving a solid whack in certain marked areas. He does repeat it a few times on each side. Try it now! It turns over freely. Do that hammer on there, markings, every time. Said other group was a bit shocked, but thrilled, and then requested he write down what he did, like he offered in the first place. The trick here was in all that and all in-house work they did, with any early Unix, every engine was unique. They had relatively poor control of the metals and casting in general. Differences in molds and castings created different deformalities in the cylinders. Bad metallurgical control back then made large differences in voids and inclusions in the metal, and as it was cooling, the difference in expansion would cause the pistons to catch. You had to know the engines, judge the differences between the casting by color of the metal, and know where they lay it cold and hot. Then, once you figure out where it was struck, you had to break it loose, bang it on from the outside at the area, each engine its own creature.
Later in the production, the technologies and techniques matured, as did the metallurgy, and it became a non-issue and everyone forgot. So he got his only ever paid vacation, and his master got a nice fat bonus for an hour and a half of work, all because they wouldn't accept him writing down to measure it a few times, then beat on it in the odd spots, which was the gist of the written instructions he left behind afterward. No, they said he had to do it himself, and he did all the way to the bank. Well, that was some great old-timey percussive maintenance if I've ever seen it. This was probably one of my favorite stories. I absolutely love these old stories that people tell. It's great because it kind of gives you an idea of how things used to operate back then, which is a lot differently than now. I mean, yes, percussive maintenance definitely still exists. It doesn't fix too much nowadays. My dad used to have a car that gave him issues. He ended up having to junk the car because he just couldn't figure out how to fix it. He brings it to the junkyard, and the guy was more than happy to take it. And as he goes to hand it over, the guy goes, "You sure you want to do this?" He goes, "I got a way to fix this." And my dad's like, "Sure, fine." And the guy goes into the back room, takes out a hammer, and smacks the side of the engine, and it fixes it. Apparently, there's this little glass piece that's inside the engine. I don't know exactly 100% how cars work, but there was a little glass piece that was inside the engine. What he did when he hit the engine with the hammer is he shattered that little glass piece, which allowed more air to flow through the engine. I guess it was a design flaw. To the author of this, thank you very much for sharing this. If this man tells you any more stories, please write them down. This was amazing. It just takes a while. Just got back home from the hardware shop after hiring a vehicle to get my large purchase home. Part of the hiring process is you must fill the vehicle up before returning it. When I got the vehicle, it had a quarter of a tank missing, so I took a picture of the fuel gauge and the odometer to show them when I returned the vehicle. I traveled a total of round trip about 4 kilometers and decided that a couple bucks was enough to make up the difference. I then took a picture of the gauge after putting fuel in it when I returned it to show that it was the same level. When I got back, I informed the girl that the car wasn't full when I got it and showed her the picture. She told me that it was full and that they filled it after the last person used it because they didn't fill it and it just takes a while for it to register on the gauge. She sent out her worker to check the fuel, and right enough she comes back saying that the tank was indeed only 3/4 full. She then informed me that they would have to charge me a fill-up fee and for the fuel. I said, well, that's not going to happen, and told her that I had put the fuel in it and that, as she rightly knows, it just takes a while for it to register on the gauge. She then looked at me dumbstruck and signed off on the vehicle as full.
We've all had to rent a truck here and there, but the one thing I found interesting about the story is that the company never took the initiative initially when the guy rented the truck and did a walk around and also checked the fuel gauge with him. Usually that's something companies do. That way there's no he said, she said stuff going on. But in the end, he ended up not having to pay a thing because, well, she kind of backed herself into the corner with her own words. So I really, really appreciated that. Though, if you're a company and you're doing this type of thing, make sure you walk around with the person. Actually, and if they don't, you as a customer, make sure they walk around with you. Like, if I ever rent a car, I drag that person around the whole car with me. We check the gauge together, because I don't want to have these issues. I really don't. I just heard nightmares about these issues, and you don't want to pay that stupid Philip fine. It's so dumb. It's so dumb. So those are all the stories today. Easily my favorite's the old man in the train, not only because of the length, but because of the just insight of the time. I found it more entertaining than anything. I want to know what you guys think. Please tell me in the comment section below. Also, I like hearing from you guys. I really do. It puts a big old smile on my face every time I do. So you guys have been great. You guys have been fantastic. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, ring that bell icon, and maybe just leave a like. Just leave a like. That's a thing that people do. Hey, if you're feeling really froggy, you could always try joining my Patreon too. You can find it in the link below. You guys have been great. You guys have been fantastic. And as usual, as always, my friends, stay frosty and keep moving forward.
At first you think Cruella's the devil, but after time has worn away the shock, you come to realize you've seen her kind of eyes watching you from underneath the rock. This vampire bat, this inhuman beast, she ought to be locked up and never released. The world was such a wholesome place until